How a bank robbery turned into a national nightmare. The sound of gunshots cracked through the walls of the Credit Bank in Stockholm. Customers froze, hands trembling, as two masked men stormed in with rifles raised high. Shouts of, "Nobody move!" echoed against the marble floors. Within minutes, the robbers had trapped 4 people, 3 women and 1 man, inside a vault, locking them away as the police surrounded the building. The world outside had no idea that this robbery would twist into something no one could explain. What happened inside that bank over the next 6 days would shock the entire nation, and even change how psychology understands fear. But at this moment, the captives weren't screaming. They weren't even fighting. They were looking at their captors, almost with sympathy. Just hours before, the day had started like any other in downtown Stockholm. Clerks greeted customers with polite smiles, the smell of fresh paper and ink hanging in the air. It was late morning, and people moved in and out of the bank, dropping off checks and chatting about lunch plans. No one noticed the blue Ford pulling up quietly at the curb. No one paid attention as 2 men stepped out, coats draped over their weapons. In seconds, ordinary life shattered. The taller man, later identified as Jan Erik Olsson, fired into the ceiling, his voice steady as he ordered everyone to the floor. "This is a robbery," he declared, his Swedish accent sharp, though to the victims it felt like the voice of doom. The police arrived quickly, sirens wailing as the building was sealed off. Snipers set up on rooftops, reporters flooded the streets, and negotiators shouted through megaphones. Inside, however, something stranger was beginning. Olsson, the gunman, checked on the hostages one by one. He offered them blankets when they shivered. He loosened ropes so their arms wouldn't go numb. "I would and hurt you if you don't try to hurt me," he said. At first, the kindness seemed like a trick, a way to keep the captives calm. But soon, the lines blurred. The captives began to see him less as a monster and more as their only protector against the chaos of the police outside. Still, tension snapped like a whip when the first demand came. Olsson shouted that he wanted a fellow criminal, Clark Olofsson, released from prison and brought to the bank. The authorities froze. Bringing another criminal into the crisis could make it worse, but refusing could push Olsson to start killing. Crowds gathered, holding their breath as the police chief's voice cracked over the loudspeaker. And just as the standoff seemed to balance on the edge of disaster, the unthinkable happened. One of the hostages spoke up, not against the robber, but against the police. The room went silent. The hostage's words cut through the chaos like a blade. "Don't hurt him," she cried out, her voice trembling but firm. Everyone expected her to beg the police for rescue, to scream for freedom, but instead, she was defending the man who had just locked her inside a vault with a gun pointed at her chest. The police outside stared in disbelief. Was this fear talking, or something darker? Inside, the other hostages nodded faintly, as if they too were beginning to see Olsson not as the villain, but as their shield against the storm waiting beyond the bank's doors. It was the first sign of a strange bond forming, one that nobody could explain, and it left investigators shaking their heads. Hours turned into night, and the bank transformed from a place of business into a prison of whispers and shadows. The hostages huddled together on the cold floor, whispering to one another when they thought no one was listening. Yet, when Olsson walked by, they stopped, not out of fear, but almost respect. He spoke to them like either people, not pawns. He told them stories about his childhood, about mistakes he had made, even joked about how the police outside were too scared to come in. The hostages laughed nervously, as though clinging to any moment of relief they could find. One of the women even asked if she could walk around to stretch her legs. Olsson agreed. It was a small gesture, but it blurred the line between captor and captive even further. Meanwhile, outside the bank, tension grew heavier by the hour. Crowds filled the streets, reporters shouted questions, and every news station in Sweden broadcasted updates. The police feared the situation would spiral out of control. Negotiators tried to reason with Olsson, but he held firm. "Bring me Clark Olofsson, or this ends badly." After long debate, the government made a shocking choice. They agreed to release Clark, a convicted robber already serving time, and bring him to the bank. It was a decision that stunned the country. People gasped as they watched authorities actually escort a criminal into an active hostage scene. When Clark walked into the credit bank, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The hostages stared at him wide-eyed, not with fear, but with something closer to relief, as though reinforcements had arrived. The 2 men embraced like brothers, and Clark assured the hostages that no harm would come to them. "We'll take care of you," he said calmly. For the first time, the hostages felt safe, safer with the criminals than with the police waiting outside. And as the second night fell over Stockholm, Olsen and Clark began whispering about a daring plan, one that would push the crisis into even more dangerous territory. The whispers grew louder as the night dragged on. The hostages leaned in, listening, their hearts pounding at every word. Olsen and Clark spoke about escaping with the captives as shields, using them as bargaining chips against the heavily armed police outside. The idea hung in the air like a noose, choking the already thin air inside the bank. One of the women began to cry softly, but to everyone's soothes. Prize, Clark placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, we won't let them shoot you," he said. The words, meant to comfort, twisted the situation even further. The hostages began to believe that their safety depended not on the police, but on the men holding them at gunpoint. Outside, pressure was building to storm the bank. Politicians demanded quick action. Families of the hostages begged for their release, and journalists painted the robbers as cold-blooded monsters. Yet inside, the reality was different. The captives started to trust Olsen and Clark, more than the voices echoing through the bullhorns outside. One of the women even told the police negotiators, "We're not afraid of them, we're afraid of you." The officers were stunned. How could victims of a crime defend the very criminals holding them hostage? It was an answer nobody could make sense of, and it made the authorities hesitate even more. On the third day, exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone. The hostages were pale and weak, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Yet when Olsen handed them food, they thanked him. When he joked about how the police were losing control, they smiled faintly. It was as if the walls of the bank had sealed them into a new world with its own twisted rules. Fear and survival had begun to rewrite their minds, binding them closer to their captors in ways they couldn't explain. But peace never lasted long. That afternoon, as Clark argued with the negotiators through the phone, shots suddenly rang out. Bullets shattered glass, and plaster rained from the ceiling. Police had fired warning shots, hoping to shake the criminals into surrender. Instead, chaos exploded. The hostages screamed, diving for cover as Olsen shouted curses and raised his rifle. Dust filled the air. In that terrifying moment, one of the hostages did something unthinkable. She ran toward Olsen, hing his arm as if to protect him from the bullets raining in from outside. The scene froze in disbelief. A hostage shielding her captor, something no one watching from the outside could have imagined. Olsen looked down at the woman clinging to him, her eyes wide with terror, and for a moment his voice softened. "Stay behind me," he said, pulling her closer to safety. The other hostages huddled together, shaken by the gunfire, while the police outside shouted for calm. To the officers, it looked like the criminals had brainwashed their victims. But inside the bank, the truth was more complicated. The hostages were convinced the police were the greater danger. If the officers stormed the building, they would be the first ones to die. To them, Olsen and Clark were not enemies, they were protectors. As silence returned, the standoff grew even darker. Olsen grabbed the phone and barked at the negotiators. His voice thundered with rage. "If you fire again, I'll kill every single one of them." His words sent shivers through the room, but strangely, none of the hostages screamed or begged. Instead, one of them whispered, "Don't make them angry. Just listen to him." Their loyalty, born out of fear, now sounded like faith. Every word from the police was met with suspicion. Every word from Olsen or Clark felt like truth. The shift was complete. The hostages no longer saw themselves as victims.